The long-awaited return. Monica Wilson's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, her knuckles almost glowing white, as she navigated the quiet streets of Millbrook. The small town seemed almost untouched by time, a stark contrast to the turmoil that churned inside her. With its charming little shops, tree-lined roads, and the serene feeling of peace, it was the kind of place that had always seemed far removed from her life. But today, Millbrook felt like the center of her world. Her heart was heavy with a storm of emotions she hadn't expected to feel. The last time she had seen her father, she was only a child, innocent and unaware of the complexities of the world. Now, years later, she was a grown woman with scars of her own. She had lived a lifetime of challenges without him by her side, but today she was on her way to reunite with him. It should have been a joyous occasion, the kind of moment that families dream of, a homecoming after years of separation. But Monica's heart was a battleground, torn between relief and a gnawing sense of anger. Her father, David Wilson, had been wrongfully imprisoned for decades, a victim of a corrupt system that had torn their lives apart. He had been released recently, finally free after years of suffering. But it didn't feel like a simple return. Monica didn't just want to see her father. She needed answers. Why had he been taken away from her in the first place? Why had he been silenced by a system that promised justice, but never delivered? All these questions had swirled in her mind for years, unanswered, festering. But now, as she drove through the sleepy streets of Millbrook, it all seemed to come rushing back. Her dark eyes scanned the road ahead, but she hardly saw the town's familiar landmarks. Her mind was elsewhere, reliving every moment she had spent growing up without her father by her side. The pain of not having him there during pivotal moments in her life weighed on her heart. Her graduation, he had missed it. Her first heartbreak, he hadn't been there to console her. Her struggles with adulthood, she had fought those battles alone. She could feel the sting of it all rising in her chest, but it was more than just resentment. It was the haunting emptiness of all those lost years, a father-daughter relationship that never had a chance to bloom. It was hard to accept, but Monica knew she couldn't blame her father. The mistake that had put him away was one that had been forced upon him. It wasn't his fault that he was in prison all those years. The circumstances were beyond his control. But that didn't mean the pain of his absence was any easier to bear. She had lived a lifetime with a hole in her heart, a missing piece that no amount of time could heal. Monica's grip on the wheel tightened as she drove past the park where children played. She caught sight of a father pushing his little girl on a swing, the joy on the child's face a sharp contrast to the emptiness inside Monica. Her heart twisted, and for a moment, it felt as though she might suffocate in the weight of it all. That could have been us, she thought bitterly, blinking back tears. She couldn't allow herself to cry. Not now, not when she was so close to her father. The car slowed as she approached the address written on a crumpled piece of paper in her lap. The house wasn't much, just a small, modest place tucked away at the end of a quiet street. To anyone else, it might have seemed unremarkable, but to Monica, it represented the possibility of reconciliation. It was where her father had been living since his release, and for the first time in years, Monica was about to see him face to face. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned into the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. She parked the car, her hands still trembling. She looked at the small house, its white paint chipped from years of wear. It wasn't the grand reunion she had imagined in her mind. No hugs, no celebrations, just a house and a father waiting inside. But this was the reality. It was raw and real, and it felt uncertain. Monica sat still in the car for a moment, her eyes fixed on the front door. She had been waiting for this moment her entire life, but now that she was here, she didn't know what to expect. Was her father the same man she remembered, or had the years in prison changed him? Could they still connect after all this time? Her mind raced with questions, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by doubt. Before she could open the door, a sound broke her reverie. A voice, sharp and commanding, came from outside the car. "Mom, please pull over." Monica froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't seen any sirens, hadn't noticed any flashing lights behind her. But now, a police officer was standing beside her window, his expression unreadable. She blinked, momentarily disoriented, before reaching for the handle to roll down the window. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with confusion. The officer, tall and wearing a dark uniform, leaned down to look inside the car. There was an odd intensity in his gaze, and for a moment, Monica couldn't quite read his expression. He glanced at her license plate, then back at her, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something. "Where are you headed today, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Monica hesitated for a moment. She hadn't expected a traffic stop, but she had nothing to hide. "I'm going to see my father," she replied, her voice steady. "He just got out of prison." The officer's eyes flickered with something, a mixture of surprise and recognition, maybe. But he quickly masked it with a professional smile. "I see," he said slowly, his gaze still lingering on her for a beat too long. "Do you mind if I ask your name?" Monica's brow furrowed, but she nodded. Monica Wilson." At the sound of her last name, the officer's expression shifted subtly. His eyes widened, just slightly, before he composed himself again. "Monica Wilson. That name sounds familiar." Monica's stomach tightened. "Yes, my father's David Wilson. He's been wrongfully imprisoned for years, and I'm here to finally see him." The officer paused, the air between them thick with unspoken words. He didn't move for several seconds, his eyes scanning her face, as though trying to decide whether to say something. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice lower now, almost hesitant, "I think you should know that there's something unusual about your father's release. Something more complicated than you might have been told." Monica's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "He was wrongfully imprisoned, and now he's free. What's complicated about that?" The officer seemed to struggle with his words. He cleared his throat, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. "I'm not sure how to explain this," he said quietly, "but I'm afraid there's more to your father's case than you realize. And there are things that people, powerful people, don't want you to know." Monica's mind reeled. What was he saying? Was this some kind of joke, or was something far more sinister going on? The officer's voice dropped even lower. "You need to be careful, Miss Wilson. There are people who will go to great lengths to keep the truth hidden." Monica's pulse quickened. "What truth?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step back, as if giving her a moment to process. Then, after another long pause, he finally spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Your father wasn't just a prisoner, Miss Wilson. He was part of something, much bigger than you can imagine." Monica's breath caught in her throat. Her world seemed to tilt on its axis. She had been waiting for this moment for so long. And now, it felt like the truth she had been seeking was about to shatter everything she thought she knew. A shocking revelation. Monica's heart thundered in her chest as the officer's words echoed in her mind. "Your father wasn't just a prisoner, Miss Wilson. He was part of something much bigger than you can imagine." The air seemed to thicken around her breath shallow as she tried to process what he had just said. What did he mean? Monica struggled to maintain control of her thoughts, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. Her stomach twisted in knots, an unexplainable sense of dread creeping up her spine. The officer took another step back, his boots crunching lightly against the gravel. He glanced around, as if making sure no one was watching, and then lowered his voice even further. "Listen, Miss Wilson, I know this is a lot to take in, but you need to understand something. Your father, David Wilson, he was involved in a covert operation. It's not just that he was wrongfully imprisoned. There are secrets surrounding his case, things that have been kept hidden from the public." Monica's mind was racing. A covert operation. Secrets. What was he talking about? She had always known her father's story. He was a man unjustly accused, a man who had suffered for something he didn't do. That was the version of the story she had lived with for years. The idea of him being involved in something hidden, something shadowy, was inconceivable. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. The officer's expression was grave, his eyes darting back to the house she had just parked in front of. Monica followed his gaze, her mind struggling to keep up with the magnitude of the conversation unfolding. "You're not saying my father was involved in something criminal, are you?" she asked, her voice trembling, unsure if she even wanted the answer. The officer's expression softened, though his eyes remained intense. "No, not criminal in the way you might think, but he was part of something larger, something that was never meant to see the light of day. I can't go into the specifics, but I need you to understand. Your father was wrongfully imprisoned, yes, but it wasn't just because of a mistake. There were powerful people who wanted him out of the way, and they manipulated the system to ensure that." Monica's breath hitched as she processed the gravity of his words. Manipulated the system. Her father wasn't just a victim of a broken justice system. He was somehow caught in a web of secrets and power that extended beyond her understanding. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've read everything. I've seen the court documents. He was wrongly convicted of a crime he didn't commit. That's what they told me." The officer's gaze turned hard, a flicker of something darker crossing his features. "That's what they wanted you to believe. That's the narrative they created to cover up the truth. Your father's case wasn't just about one man. It was about what he knew, what he could expose. And now that he's been released, things are about to get much, much more complicated." Monica's pulse quickened. "Complicated? How? Why? What does this have to do with me?" The officer seemed torn, as though battling with himself over whether to reveal more. He glanced over his shoulder, his hand twitching near his radio, before looking back at Monica. "Because it's not just about your father anymore, Miss Wilson. It's about you. You're connected to this, and there are people out there who will do whatever it takes to make sure the truth stays buried. They'll stop at nothing to keep you from finding out what your father was really involved in." Monica's mind spun with confusion. Connected to this? Her? How? She was just a daughter looking for answers. She had no idea that the man she'd spent years wondering about was somehow involved in a hidden world of covert operations and dangerous people. "What do you mean connected?" Monica asked, her voice shaking with a mix of disbelief and growing fear. "What does this have to do with me? I'm just trying to see my father." The officer stepped closer, his voice lowering even more, almost a whisper now. "Your father was part of something much bigger than just a case of wrongful imprisonment. He was a pawn in a larger game. The organization he was involved with, well, let's just say they have interests in people like you. They've been watching you for a long time, and they're waiting for the right moment to act." Monica's thoughts fragmented, pieces of information crashing into each other without making sense. Her hands were cold now, her pulse a steady thrum of unease. "What are you saying?" she asked, the question barely a whisper. The officer exhaled slowly, his gaze softening just a little. "I'm saying that your father's release wasn't just some random act of mercy. It's part of a larger plan. A plan that involves you, Miss Wilson. You're not just a bystander in this. You're part of it, whether you realize it or not." Monica recoiled, as if the words were physical blows. "I don't understand. Why me? Why would they care about me?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes filled with a deep, almost sorrowful look. "I can't explain everything right now, but there are people, powerful people, who will do whatever it takes to protect their secrets. Your father knew something he shouldn't have, and they'll do everything in their power to stop you from learning the truth. They've kept an eye on you for years, Miss Wilson. You've been a part of this from the moment your father was arrested." Monica felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her world was unraveling, and the man in front of her was a messenger of a truth so dark, so overwhelming, that she didn't know how to grasp it. Her father wasn't just a victim. He had been a part of something hidden, and she was now somehow tied to it. "How do you know all of this?" she asked, her voice barely audible, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. The officer's eyes flickered to the side, then back to her, as if considering whether to trust her with more. After a tense silence, he answered, "I was involved too, but I'm not on their side anymore, Miss Wilson. I've seen the lengths they're willing to go to keep the truth buried, and I'm trying to help you, trying to give you a chance to find out what really happened before it's too late." Monica's breath caught in her throat. Involved? What was he saying? Was he a part of this conspiracy, or was he truly trying to help her? Before she could say anything more, the officer's expression hardened, and he stepped back, his hand reaching for his radio. "I've said too much already. You need to be careful, Miss Wilson. You need to get to your father and make sure you're not followed. Don't trust anyone, not even the people who say they're trying to help you. They're all connected." Monica felt a chill creep down her spine. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything the officer had just revealed. But the warning in his eyes was clear. She was no longer just a daughter looking for closure. She was caught in a web of lies, and now she had no choice but to follow the trail her father had left behind, wherever it might lead. The officer took a final glance at her, then turned and walked away without another word. Monica sat in the car, her hands trembling on the wheel. The street, the house, everything around her seemed distant now, as if the world had shifted into a new reality. One where her father's past and her future were bound together in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. She couldn't ignore the officer's warning. Her father's release had been just the beginning. And now Monica was standing at the edge of something much darker than she had ever imagined. But one thing was clear: if she wanted the truth, she would have to fight for it. Into the unknown. Monica sat in the car, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her mind spinning from the officer's words. A larger plan, hidden truths, powerful people. She couldn't shake the chilling sensation that had taken over her entire body. The reality of the situation was setting in, but it felt like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The officer's cryptic warning rang in her ears. "You're part of it, whether you realize it or not." The street around her was eerily quiet, the chirping of distant birds and the rustling of leaves the only sounds. The house in front of her, where her father now lived, seemed so small and insignificant compared to the dark revelation she had just been given. It was as though the walls of her entire existence had been ripped away, revealing a web of deceit and hidden motives that had always been there, just beyond her vision. Monica took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to center herself. She needed to think clearly. "I need to get to my father," she told herself. "I need answers." But where would she begin? The officer had hinted at something so vast and complex that it was almost incomprehensible. Who could she trust? How could she even begin to untangle the threads of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined? Her gaze shifted back to the house. It was a modest, single-story home with peeling white paint and a small porch. It looked so ordinary, yet Monica couldn't shake the feeling that something far from ordinary was unfolding behind its walls. Her father had been locked away for years, and now, after his release, he was meant to have a second chance. But was he really free? Or had he simply become another piece in a much larger game? She reached for the door handle, her body trembling. She had to see her father. She couldn't let the officer's words cloud her judgment, not yet. There was no evidence to suggest that anything sinister was going on, at least not directly. She needed to confront her father, to hear his side of the story. But the nagging feeling in her gut told her that the truth was far more complicated than she was ready for. Monica stepped out of the car and made her way up the gravel driveway, her footsteps slow and deliberate. As she approached the front door, she hesitated for just a moment. Her hand hovered above the doorbell, but something inside her held her back. She wasn't sure what it was, but the weight of uncertainty was suffocating. Before she could ring the bell, the door creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was him, David Wilson, her father. Monica's breath caught in her throat. He looked different. The years had not been kind to him, but he was still the man she remembered, just older, weathered by time, and the brutality of the system that had torn him away from her. His dark eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of surprise, regret, and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite place. Monica. His voice was rough, but there was a warmth there, a recognition. You're here. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stood there, facing each other, the years between them stretching out like an abyss. It was almost as if time had stopped. And all that mattered in that instant was the reunion, the long-awaited moment that neither of them had ever truly thought would come. I didn't know what to expect, Monica said, her voice trembling as she finally found her words. I didn't know if you'd even want to see me. I didn't know if you. Her father raised a hand, cutting her off. Don't, Monica. Don't apologize. I'm the one who owes you so many apologies. But you're here now, and that's all that matters. Monica felt a lump form in her throat. He looked so broken, yet he's still here. Her father had been through unimaginable pain, and here he was, standing before her, alive, yet clearly affected by the years of hardship. I don't know where to begin, she whispered, stepping forward. There's so much I don't understand. David stepped aside, gesturing for her to come inside. Come in. We have a lot to talk about. I know I owe you explanations, more than I can even begin to give you, but I want you to hear it from me, Monica. I need you to know the truth. Monica stepped into the small house, her senses immediately overwhelmed by the smell of old wood and the faint scent of something that reminded her of home. It wasn't much, but it was his. She felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. The walls were bare, save for a few photographs, some of them old and worn, others new. There was a dusty bookshelf in the corner, stacked with books she couldn't recognize, and a small kitchen table in the next room where a cup of coffee sat, long forgotten. David closed the door behind her and led her to the couch, motioning for her to sit. Monica sat down, her nerves buzzing with anticipation. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to feel. What if the truth is too much to bear? Her father sat beside her, his hands clasped together in his lap, his eyes downcast. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if he were searching for the right words. Then, with a deep sigh, he spoke. I never wanted you to know this, Monica, he began, but I don't have any choice now. What I'm about to tell you, it's not just about me. It's about you. Monica's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on him. What do you mean? What does this have to do with me? David hesitated, his gaze darting to the window, then back to her. I'm not just some innocent man who was wrongfully convicted. I was caught up in something much bigger, something I couldn't escape. I didn't want you to know this, but now it's out there, and I can't hide from it anymore. Monica's mind raced. She had always believed in the story she'd been told, the one about her father being a victim of a corrupt system. But now, his words seemed to be shattering that narrative, piece by piece. What do you mean? What was bigger than the system? David took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. There are things I got involved in. Things that started before my arrest. Things that I didn't fully understand at the time. I was working for a group, a faction that had its hands in politics, law enforcement, even intelligence. They wanted me to do certain things, and I didn't know what it would cost until it was too late. Monica's head spun. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. A faction, politics, law enforcement, intelligence, her father, a pawn in a larger game. She had never known him to be anything other than a simple man, but now it was clear her father's story was not what she had been led to believe. Why didn't you tell me this before? Monica asked, her voice barely audible. David's eyes welled with tears, his voice cracking. Because I thought I could protect you. I thought if I kept you away from it all, you'd be safe. But now I'm afraid that you're already too involved." Monica shook her head, trying to absorb the enormity of what he was saying. "What do you mean, I'm involved? I don't even understand what's going on." David stood up and walked over to the window, looking out into the quiet street. "It's bigger than both of us, Monica, and it's coming for you. You need to be ready, because once you know the truth, there's no turning back." Monica stood up, her pulse racing. "I'm ready. I've been ready for years." David turned to her, his face pale but resolute. "Then brace yourself, because the real fight is just beginning." The past resurfaces. The silence that followed David's words hung heavy in the room, thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. Monica stood frozen, her mind reeling. The real fight is just beginning. The words echoed in her head as her father's face, filled with sorrow and regret, stared back at her. She didn't know whether she should be terrified or determined, and the uncertainty gnawed at her insides. For years, she had only wanted one thing: answers. Now, it seemed, the answers she had longed for had brought with them more questions, and with those questions came a dangerous unknown. "How much did you know, Dad?" Monica asked, her voice steady despite the torrent of emotions swirling within her. "How deep was it? What kind of people were you dealing with?" David's face tightened, his brow furrowed. He took a few steps towards the small bookshelf in the corner, then grabbed a dusty old folder from one of the shelves. He brought it back to the couch and handed it to Monica. The folder was heavy, almost as if it contained more than just paper. She hesitated for a moment before taking it from him. "You won't understand everything at first," he said quietly. "But this is the key. This will give you the answers you've been looking for." Monica opened the folder slowly, careful not to tear the worn pages inside. As she flipped through the papers, her eyes scanned the documents, redacted reports, old photographs, and handwritten notes that looked like they belonged to another lifetime. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that this wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a record of everything her father had been involved in. A past she had never known existed, and a future she wasn't sure she wanted to face. The first photograph she came across showed a group of men and women standing together in front of a large government building. They were smiling, almost too casually, as though they didn't realize they were being photographed. Monica's eyes scanned the faces in the picture, and she stopped at one in particular, a man with dark hair and a serious expression. Her father was standing next to him, a younger version of himself with a confident posture, looking as if he belonged. "That man," Monica whispered, pointing at the figure. "Who is he?" David's eyes followed her finger. "That's Agent William Royce. He was one of the leaders of the operation I got involved in. But back then, I didn't know how dangerous he was. I didn't realize the extent of what they were doing. I thought it was just a job, a way to make sure I could survive. I didn't know they had plans for something much bigger." Monica's stomach churned. She could feel the tension in the room building as she continued to flip through the documents. The names and codes blurred together, but one phrase caught her attention: Operation Shadowfall. The words seemed to leap off the page, and for some reason, they'd made her pulse race. "What is Operation Shadowfall?" she asked, her voice trembling as she looked up from the folder. David swallowed hard, his face paling. That's what I was a part of. It wasn't just about being a pawn in a government investigation. It was much worse. Shadowfall was an operation that involved deep cover agents in multiple sectors of society. Its goal was to control information, manipulate political outcomes, and eliminate anyone who threatened the agenda. Your father was just a small part of it, a cog in the machine. Monica's hand shook as she turned the page. Her father's name appeared in several reports, linked to high-level meetings, encrypted communications, and codes that she didn't understand. She could feel the weight of the documents pressing on her chest, as though the very papers in her hands were pushing her deeper into a world she had never asked to be a part of. "I had no idea, Monica. They pulled me in when I was at my lowest, offered me a way to escape my problems, and I thought it was just a job. I thought it was just another assignment. But when I started to understand what they were really doing, when I saw the way they controlled everything, I couldn't walk away. They had me trapped. Monica's heart ached for her father. She had always seen him as a victim of circumstance, but now she was learning that the man she thought she knew had been living in the shadows, forced to make choices that tore him apart. The weight of guilt in his voice was palpable, and she knew that he had carried this burden for years. "But why didn't you tell me?" Monica asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you leave me in the dark?" David's face softened, and he sat down beside her. "I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to know what I had gotten myself into. The less you knew, the safer you were. I kept my distance, kept quiet, because I thought that was the only way I could keep you out of harm's way. But I was wrong. I should have told you sooner. I should have trusted you with the truth." Monica stared down at the folder, the harsh reality of it all settling like a heavy weight in her chest. She had always thought her father's absence was a result of some injustice, a mistake that had stolen him from her. But now, she understood that it was something far more complicated and far more dangerous. "I don't know how to process all of this," Monica admitted, her voice raw with emotion. "This is so much more than I ever imagined. I thought I was just going to see you and ask for answers. But now I have more questions than I know what to do with." David placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "I know, Monica, and I'm sorry for that. But we don't have much time. If you want the full truth, if you want to understand everything, you have to act quickly. They're still watching. They're always watching." Monica looked up at him, her mind racing. "They're still watching. Who?" The officer's warning came flooding back. "You're part of it, Miss Wilson. You've been a part of this from the moment your father was arrested." Monica's head swirled with fear and confusion. "What do you mean? Who's watching us?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, even though the fear in her chest was growing. David's expression hardened, and he looked over his shoulder, as if making sure they were still alone. "I don't know how much time we have before they realize I've been talking to you. They've been keeping tabs on me, and now that you're here, they'll be focused on you too. The people I worked with, they don't forgive mistakes. They don't let anyone slip away." Monica felt her heart race as she grasped the enormity of her situation. She was no longer just a daughter seeking closure. She was tangled in something far bigger than her, something dark, something powerful. And the more she learned, the deeper she would fall into a world she had never known existed. "We need to get ahead of them, Monica," David said urgently. "I can't tell you everything right now, but we need to move fast. There are things I need to show you, things I need to explain before it's too late." Monica nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready. I've been ready for years. I'm not walking away from this." David's eyes softened with a mixture of pride and worry. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." Monica stood up, determination burning in her chest. She didn't know where this journey would take her, or what she would find along the way. But one thing was clear: she would not back down. Not now. Not ever. As they prepared to leave the house, the weight of their decisions felt almost suffocating. The world outside might have seemed quiet and peaceful, but Monica knew better. The real battle was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. The labyrinth unfolds. The sharp click of the front door echoed in the otherwise quiet house. Monica could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears, and the weight of the moment hung over her like a storm about to break. Her father, David, led the way through the small hallway, past the dimly lit living room, and toward the back door. Each step felt deliberate, each movement carrying the gravity of everything they had just learned. Monica's mind was still spinning. Every word her father had spoken seemed to pull her deeper into a maze of secrets, and the more she learned, the less she understood. It was like the layers of her life had been peeled away, exposing a network of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. She had believed her father was simply a man wronged by the system, a victim of circumstance. But now, it seemed that the world was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. "Where are we going?" Monica asked, her voice low as she followed him into the backyard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and the evening air was crisp, cool against her skin. It felt like the calm before the storm, as though everything in her life was about to be upended, yet again. David didn't answer immediately. He paused, taking in the sight of the yard, as if unsure of where to begin. After a long moment, he turned to her. "There's a safe house, a place where we can lay low for a while. We can't stay here for long. They'll be looking for us." Monica's stomach clenched. She had no idea who they were or how far the danger reached, but the urgency in her father's voice made her realize that time was running out. She had to move. Safe house. Who is we? Is there someone else involved in all of this? Her father's face softened for a moment, and he took a deep breath, as though weighing how much to tell her. "No one we can trust," he said quietly, "but I've made some calls. People who can help us get out of here for a while. If we're careful, we'll be able to figure out the next steps. But we need to act quickly." Monica swallowed hard. She felt like she was living in a movie, caught in the middle of a plot she didn't sign up for. But as her father's words sank in, something clicked. This is real. This is happening. She had no idea what kind of enemies they were up against, but she was in this now. There was no turning back. They reached the back gate of the yard, where a small, nondescript car was parked in the driveway. The vehicle looked out of place in the quiet neighborhood, but that was exactly the point. It blended in, inconspicuous, ready for a fast escape. David opened the car door and gestured for Monica to get in. "We need to get moving," he urged, his tone impatient yet laced with concern. Monica climbed into the passenger seat, her nerves on edge, but a strange sense of determination started to settle over her. If she was going to uncover the truth, if she was going to understand what had happened to her father, she needed to do this. She needed to face whatever lay ahead. As the car sped down the narrow street, David drove with an efficiency that came from years of experience. Years spent under pressure, making split-second decisions. Monica barely spoke as they passed the familiar buildings of the small town, the streets she had walked down 1,000 times, now feeling foreign and unsafe. Her mind raced, processing everything her father had told her. She had learned that her father's involvement in Operation Shadowfall was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger network, one that stretched across several industries and political systems. And those people, the ones he had worked with, they were still out there, pulling strings behind the scenes, controlling outcomes, and erasing anyone who got in their way. The officer at the checkpoint, he wasn't just a cop. He was connected. He had known something about her father's past and about Monica herself. Her father had said there were people watching them. And now she realized just how dangerous those people were. Was that officer one of them? David glanced over at her as he made a sharp turn onto a quiet road. "You're probably wondering who they are," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of guilt. "I never wanted you involved in any of this, Monica. But now that you're here, you need to understand what we're dealing with." Monica's eyes flicked to him, her brow furrowed. "I'm listening. I need to understand everything if I'm going to get through this." David nodded, his jaw tight. There are powerful people involved, people who control everything, from politics to media, to law enforcement. They have their hands in every major industry, and they've been working in the shadows for decades. My involvement was just one small piece of their grand design. And now that you're involved, you're part of it too. Monica's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, I'm part of it?" David's gaze shifted to the road ahead, his expression grim. "I don't know how, but I think they've been keeping an eye on you for a while." The officer at the checkpoint, the one who stopped you, he wasn't just doing his job. He knew who you were. He was part of this network, and they have a vested interest in you, Monica. Whatever it is, whatever they're after, you're in the middle of it now. Her mind whirled, her thoughts tumbling over one another. They were watching me. She had thought it was just a random checkpoint, just another routine stop. But now, everything seemed connected. Every move, every step, it all felt like it had been part of a larger plan, one she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "We can't trust anyone, Monica," David continued, his voice low. "Even the people I thought I could trust, I found out they were working for the other side. I've been on the run for years, trying to distance myself from all of this. But the deeper I tried to bury it, the more it seemed to follow me." Monica felt a knot form in her stomach. She had always known that the world wasn't as simple as it seemed, but now, it felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the unknown. The car drove through the winding roads, passing abandoned warehouses and darkened alleys, until they reached the outskirts of town. David slowed the car as they approached an old industrial complex, its towering buildings looming in the distance. The area was desolate, far removed from the rest of the town, and Monica's unease grew with every passing second. "This is it," David said, pulling the car into a small parking lot at the edge of the complex. He cut the engine and turned to Monica. "We'll be safe here for now. It's not much, but it's secure." Monica stepped out of the car, her legs shaky as she took in her surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. The buildings around her were empty, their windows shattered and boarded up, creating a sense of isolation that only added to her anxiety. But her father's eyes, hardened with years of experience, reassured her that this was the safest option for now. "Do you think they'll find us here?" Monica asked, glancing over her shoulder as they walked toward a steel door in the side of one of the buildings. David hesitated, then nodded. "They'll be looking for us, no doubt, but they're not expecting us to come here. This place is off the grid. We got a little time before they catch up." As they entered the building, Monica was struck by how eerily silent it was. The dim light from a few flickering overhead bulbs cast long shadows across the concrete floor. The air was stale, and the smell of old machinery filled the space. David led her to a small, unmarked door at the back of the room. He opened it to reveal a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Monica felt a chill crawl up her spine as she followed him down, the weight of what was happening settling in more heavily with each step. "What is this place?" Monica asked, her voice barely a whisper. David didn't answer immediately. He reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to face her. "This is where we'll hide. This is where I'll show you everything. Everything I couldn't tell you before." Monica nodded, her heart pounding. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. As they descended deeper into the labyrinth of the unknown, Monica felt the air grow colder, the darkness pressing in around her. But in the depths of that darkness, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life. She was a player in a game that could destroy everything she thought she knew. And now, there was no way out but forward, unmasking the shadows. The stairs creaked beneath their feet as David led Monica deeper into the belly of the old industrial building. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the secrets they held. The faint hum of distant machinery reverberated through the concrete floors, adding an unsettling layer to the quiet. The further they descended, the more Monica's sense of unease grew. She wasn't sure if it was the claustrophobic space or the gravity of the situation, but something about the darkness ahead felt wrong. David paused just before they reached the bottom, his hand resting on the iron door that separated them from whatever lay beyond. "This is it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've kept this from you for so long, but you need to see it. The truth, all of it. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Monica hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She had come this far, through all the confusion, the anger, the uncertainty. But this felt like the moment where everything would change. Her life, as she knew it, would be unrecognizable after tonight. But she had no choice. She was already in too deep. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. David nodded and pushed the heavy door open, revealing a hidden room beyond. The space was small but meticulously organized. Monitors lined one wall, their screens glowing with encrypted data. Cables ran like veins across the floor, and several file cabinets stood against another wall, their metal frames covered in dust, but their contents clearly important. In the far corner, an old wooden desk held papers, folders, and a few personal items that seemed to belong to someone who had long since abandoned this place. "Welcome to the real world, Monica," David said, stepping into the room. "This is where everything happened. This is where I learned what Operation Shadowfall really was, and what it's still doing." Monica stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. The room felt like a relic, a time capsule of everything her father had been involved in. But more than that, it felt like a hidden nerve center, somewhere that not only held secrets but might also be the very place where her father's downfall had started. David walked over to one of the monitors and pressed a button, causing the screen to come alive with static before stabilizing. "This is how they control everything," he continued, pointing to the screen. "Surveillance. They keep an eye on anyone who could pose a threat, and when someone gets too close to the truth, they silence them. They make them disappear. I almost disappeared, Monica. But I managed to escape. Barely." Monica's mind reeled as she absorbed his words. Surveillance. Disappearances. She had known, deep down, that something was off, but hearing her father say it so bluntly, as though it were just a matter of fact, made her blood run cold. These weren't just shadowy figures in the background of a conspiracy theory. These were real people with real power, controlling her life and the lives of everyone around her. She stepped closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the scattered documents. The files were filled with names. Some she recognized, others she didn't. But the more she looked, the clearer it became. These were the same people who had orchestrated her father's involvement in Shadowfall and manipulated him into a life of secrecy and deception. And now, it seemed, they were watching her too. "I didn't want you to get tangled in all of this," David said softly, his voice filled with regret. "But now that you're here, now that you know, we're both in danger. If we stay here too long, they'll come for us. We need to leave before it's too late." Monica looked at her father, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. She was used to taking care of herself. After all, she had done it her whole life. But this was something else entirely. It was a world she hadn't been prepared for, one that seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of what she had ever imagined. "Who are these people, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who's behind all of this? Why did you get involved in the first place?" David paused, his eyes falling to the floor as though searching for the right words. "They're a group of powerful individuals, Monica. They've infiltrated every level of society. Government, corporations, law enforcement, even the media. They don't just control information. They manipulate it. They shape reality to fit their agenda. And they've been doing it for decades. Operation Shadowfall was just the beginning, a way for them to test their methods, to see how far they could push before anyone caught on. But I was naive. I thought I was just doing my part. I never realized how far they would go." Monica's heart pounded in her chest. How could he not have known? It was hard to believe that her father, her strong, protective father, had been caught in something so insidious. But as she looked around the room, at the evidence in front of her, she realized that maybe it wasn't so far-fetched after all. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, and she had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. "How did you get out?" Monica asked. "How did you escape from them?" David looked at her, his expression grim. "I didn't escape alone. There were others, people who tried to leave the operation. Some succeeded, some didn't. I was lucky. I faked my death, staged it to look like I'd been caught in a car accident. I thought I could disappear, live a quiet life, but I was wrong. They knew exactly what I was doing. They kept track of me, watching my every move. And now, they know I've reached out to you." Monica's stomach churned. Faked his death. She had always believed her father had been a victim. But now she was starting to see the bigger picture. He wasn't just a man wronged by the system. He was a man who had once been part of a much darker system himself. "You've been hiding for all these years," Monica said, her voice filled with disbelief. "And now they're coming after us again." David nodded. "Yes. And this time, they won't stop until they've erased every trace of us. They want to make sure no one ever learns the truth. But you're not going to let them, are you?" Monica swallowed hard, her hands trembling. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just trying to uncover the truth about her father anymore. Now she was fighting for her life, and the stakes had never been higher. "I won't let them get away with it," she said, her voice full of resolve. "I won't let them destroy everything." David smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I knew you had it in you. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, Monica. But you need to understand something. This is only the beginning. If we want to survive, we need to expose them, to take down the entire operation. And that's not going to be easy." Monica nodded, her mind racing. She had no idea how they were going to pull this off. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the room, and Monica's heart skipped a beat. David's eyes widened, and he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the far corner of the room. "They're here," he hissed. "We don't have much time." Monica felt a surge of adrenaline rush through her. They were already here. She glanced around the room, her eyes searching for an escape, a way out. David pulled open a small hatch in the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel. "Get in. Now," he commanded. Monica didn't hesitate. She didn't have time to think. She followed her father into the tunnel, the door closing silently behind them. The walls of the tunnel were cold and damp, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. As they moved deeper into the darkness, Monica's mind raced. She didn't know where the tunnel would lead, but she didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. "We'll figure this out," David said, his voice calm but urgent. "We just need to stay one step ahead. We can't let them find us. Not now." Monica's breath came in shallow gasps as she followed him through the darkened passage. The future, once so uncertain, was now a terrifying, thrilling unknown. And as the tunnel stretched out before them, one thing was clear. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. This was about survival. And Monica Wilson was ready to fight for it.